Well, thank you very much for your kind words of introduction. I was delighted to hear this emphasis on innovation, and it's not before time that innovation has now achieved the central political position in the political discourse about the future of Europe. I was indeed very familiar with Esprit. In fact, I served for 10 years on the Esprit Advisory Board. As you rightly pointed out, it was quite a modest undertaking at the time because we noticed that the total amount that we spent on R&D in Europe during the Esprit times, which was the forerunner of the framework program, was equivalent to our spending on tomato subsidies. Now, as you know, things haven't changed all that much because of the completely disproportionate balance between agriculture and innovation. I mean, if there ever was a political scandal in terms of looking backwards rather than forwards, it is that balance between the amount of money that Europe is willing to spend on agriculture, which, as we heard, employs 1.6% of the population, and innovation, which, given that unemployment is probably our number one problem in Europe, and innovation is the way out of this unemployment situation, because, as we know, small companies create jobs, big companies create wealth. But if you look at big companies do not create jobs at the same rate that small companies. So what I want to talk to you about tonight really is all to do with innovation. I have spent a lifetime helping companies and projects out of universities into successful companies. I'm probably one of two people in the UK and probably a handful of Europeans that have funded more than 100 companies. So I'm no smarter than other people, I just have a lot more data. And what does the data say? Well, the data says lots of things that I think are generally accepted now. If you want to do innovation, you cannot hope to do innovation across Europe equally. Like in America, like anywhere else, innovation sort of centers around clusters, normally clusters that have specific expertise, world-class universities or leading companies in particular fields. And it's also very important that innovation in these clusters is supported in particular sectors. There is no silver bullet to create lots of innovative high-tech companies. There is a different mechanism that works in each of the different fields. So we heard earlier about Rolls-Royce doing work all over the world in research. Rolls-Royce has an excellent track record of working closely with many universities. But the way Rolls-Royce works is not a template that works for pharma or works for energy or works for the semiconductor industry or indeed the internet. All these different sectors need different expertise and different ways of getting innovation to the market. And there is a group of financiers in Europe called venture capitalists who specialize in these different sectors, and they've actually had quite a hard time since 2008. And I do run a venture capital firm as well after being a serial entrepreneur for many years, a company called Amadeus Capital Partners. And there were about 400 venture capital companies in the year 2000 that invested, and arguably that was too many, and there was too much excitement about the internet and all the high technology companies. But now we're down to 40 that have money to invest, and this is clearly too little. So as always, these pendulums swing one way and then the other. And at the moment, it's actually a very good time to invest in high technology companies and innovation. Why? Europe has always had a spectacular strength in our universities, in our expertise. We do not have a problem with technology. We do create enough research and scientific papers, and in fact we are comparable to the US in that. Interestingly, we also start enough companies. There is a myth that America starts many more companies than Europe. This is not true. We do start enough companies. The problem is we don't grow them fast enough. And it's that growth that is facilitated by venture capital, and there is so much less venture capital in Europe than there is in the States, that this has become a real problem. Hence my earlier question about the 2.7 billion that have been earmarked for financial support for innovation in Europe. And for some reason, and I don't know why, at the moment, all of that is dedicated to debt, which is useless to innovation, because companies that really innovate normally have no assets, so they cannot access the debt market. The only money that they can access is equity money. And the right way of putting equity to work in an innovation context is through funds of funds. There is a perfectly good market mechanism to deploy this money into innovation, and that is give the money to fund of funds who then select the successful teams, or venture capital teams in different sectors in Europe. And say if there was $500 million or $1 billion spent on that, if that goes into fund of funds, there would be a multiplier, because you probably only need to give 25% of a fund of funds that is supported by Europe, and the other 75% would then come from the market. So there would be probably a 3 or 4 to 1 leverage of any commission money that would be put into innovation. So in my opinion, this is the single most important thing that still needs to be decided on Horizon 2020, to make sure that the 2.7 million that have been earmarked for financial support for innovation is that a substantial part of that is put aside for equity. So let me tell you about two specific themes tonight. One is the work that I've done for the British government over many years on studying the problem of universities and industry and translation. And then I'll give you two examples of how Cambridge, where I live, has become a high technology cluster, and I'll give you two examples of companies, ARM and Solexa, that have succeeded. Of course, out of the 100 investments that I've made, there are many, many investments that I've failed that I will not tell you about today, but if you catch me afterwards, I'm very happy to own up to it. But I can tell you one particular data point, which I'm very keen for you to note. Out of the 100 investments that I've made in technology, there is one single investment that failed because the technology didn't work. Just 1 out of 100. Companies fail lots of different ways. The market isn't ready, the team breaks up, there isn't enough money for it, but there is only one single example that I have where, sadly, this researcher comes to a board meeting and tells us the project that we had where we thought we could produce a completely new optical disc. He has worked out the equation to show that this cannot be done. So we had to close down the company. But this is the one example. So about the works that I've done for government over many years. Well, the first government committee I sat on was during Esprit Times, called the ALBI Committee, when we looked at science in Europe and science in Britain in particular, and reports came in that $500 million will be spent in Korea on the semiconductor industry. The Koreans did not have a semiconductor industry. And I remember the UK government explicitly saying, this is crazy, these guys are throwing all this money on semiconductors, why would you want to to do semiconductors. And Britain had two of the leading semiconductor companies in the world at the time, Ferranti, that invented field programmable gate arrays, which are one of the main chips that are being sold in the world, and Plessy invented one of the best CMOS semiconductor processes, which also turned out to be very important. And Britain just did not provide the support for its semiconductor industry that Korea did. And those of you who know Korea, of course, know that this is now a multi-billion, multi-tens of billion sector that Korea dominates with Samsung, LG, Hynix, and the like. Then I was asked to write a report for the British government just a few years ago on technology innovation centres. So I went around the world to Korea, Taiwan, Germany with the Fraunhofer Gesellschaft, Holland with the translation, TNO translation facility that they have there, and ETRA and ITRI in Korea and Japan, respectively. And it is just very important for each European country to have an institution that can take innovation out of universities, also innovation that might take a long time to develop. So these technology innovation centres, which are now called Catapults in the UK, have a time frame that's longer than 10 years. Things that are much shorter than 10 years can be funded by venture capital funds, but all venture capital funds have a 10-year time horizon. So if there are projects, in particular in energy or in materials, that always take longer than 10 years, there are really only two sources of funding we can have for them, and that's either the government or very large companies that take a long-term view. So my proposal, which has been adopted by the British government, and there are £200 million now being spent on them, but I understand that the government is willing to spend a lot more over the next few years, is to set up 7 of these catapult centres, and these are the criteria that I put forward which were accepted. The first criterion is that we've got to have world-leading research and world-leading technology for a catapult to be set up, so that it's not a matter of filling in holes, it's a matter of building on mountains, because if we don't have a world-leading position, we have no chance of competing on a global scale, and this has become very much a global game. The second criterion was that the technology that we are going to support that way had to have buy-in from industry. So the funding model is, in fact, the same as with the Fraunhofer Gesellschaft, that a third of the money has to come from industry, a third comes from the government, and then the last third comes from project finance, which could also include framework program funding. And the last criterion was that Britain or any other country ought to have the absorptive capacity, that when finally we produce some interesting results that could benefit Europe to exploit some new technology, there is the infrastructure and there is the capability of the country to take advantage of this. So this has been quite a successful project. As I said, there are 7 of these catapult centres in a number of different areas, like stem cell technology, offshore wind technology, automotive technology. I don't know how many of you know that Britain actually now produces more cars than it ever has, and has become a net exporter of cars, very much to my surprise. And this is because there are some very good infrastructure in the Midlands. At present, I'm chairing a committee of the Royal Society. The Royal Society is our oldest scientific society, which was founded in 1660. And when you get elected to the Royal Society, as I have had the pleasure of being, I think I'm the first venture capitalist that has ever become an FRS of the Royal Society. You sign this book, and they're all sort of very hush-hush about this book, and you wear the special glove to sign the thing in the book. And they say, what's so special about this book? Well, it's rather old, they say. So it stems from the 17th century. Well, who else has signed the book? Well, Newton and Einstein and all these famous people. So the Royal Society is our top scientific society, and the Royal Society has always had really quite a close relationship with industry and always been very applied. The Royal Society produced these big challenges in the 18th and 19th century, like the Harris clock. There was this big problem of finding out where you are when you're at sea with a ship. And for that, you could look at the sun and find out the latitude, but in order to find out the longitude, you had to have a very accurate clock. And there was a guy called Harris who fixed that with the Harris clock. But that was a Royal Society-sponsored project, as opposed to the equivalent to a catapult in the 18th century. What my committee is looking at is the relationship between science, industry, and the translation of science into industry. And the Royal Society is trying to move closer to industry now, that it's clear that this has become a race. This has become a race between nations, that when there is a new scientific breakthrough, when there is a new invention, a new idea that appears, it normally appears in a number of different areas in the world. And the race is between those nations that have managed to organize their affairs such so that they can translate these breakthroughs quickly into companies and exploit these breakthroughs for their economies, and those that are falling behind. And I think we have no option but to participate in this race and organize our affairs so that we do this efficiently. There are people always, of course, ask, and governments always ask, what can be done here? Well, there are a number. I sat on the Williams Committee that made 3 recommendations, all of which were taken up by the British government, and all of which had a profound effect on innovation in Britain. One was R&D tax credits. So if you spend a lot on R&D as a British company, all the amount of money that you spend on R&D, you actually get back from tax that you have paid in cash. And many, in fact, if not all of my portfolio companies at Amadeus live for another quarter on these tax credits. They've been incredibly beneficial. The second change in the law in Britain was the equivalent of the American prudent man legislation. And this is slightly counterintuitive. And the American prudent man legislation argument goes as follows. If you are a prudent man advising a pension fund, which is, of course, a very conservative investment fund, then a prudent man will take a small portion of a very large fund and put it in quite risky investments, because very risky investments give you a much higher return. Now, of course, often they fail, but when they work, they give the higher return. So this was the prudent man legislation in the US. Pension funds in the UK were not allowed to invest in risky investments at the time. They now can, and some of them still do invest in venture capital, but not enough. There isn't enough money in European venture capital. And the third thing was a change in the way options are taxed. There was a very substantial decrease in tax from about, I think at that time, 60% to just 10% for options in high technology companies. So let me now go on to universities. And the point was made earlier that it is actually quite important to have universities at a global standard. Now, Britain is, of course, doing extremely well. We have 4 universities, Cambridge normally at the top, Oxford, Imperial, and UCL in the top 10 in the world. Sadly, this is not the case elsewhere in Europe. the university system in the rest of Europe really doesn't have, we don't have many universities apart from these British universities in the top 20 or even the top 100. So this is something that we have to clearly improve on. Now let me come on to Cambridge. People often say, well, these little companies, these technology companies, what impact do they have? Well, if you aggregate all the Cambridge companies, of which there are some 1,500 high technology companies, we actually employ now over 57,000 people. So it is, a significant employer in the east of England, and we have revenues of £13 billion in aggregate. And this, when I say these 1,500 companies, £13 billion and 57,000 people employed, people often forget the numbers, of course. So I found a new way of telling you that this is important, and that is I've tried to find a company that all of you know, which is smaller than our aggregate of all our high-tech companies in Cambridge, and the answer is Rolls-Royce. Rolls-Royce has revenues of £12 billion. We have revenues of £13 billion. Rolls-Royce employs 43,000 people. We employ 47,000 people. Rolls-Royce is a fantastically successful company, growing well in Britain, but we grow faster. Rolls-Royce exports a lot and is, commended by the British government for the fantastic exports that we have with Rolls-Royce, but Cambridge exports more. So, you've got to see it in next context, because if a government feels, if Rolls-Royce needs some support, or, BMW or any of our great European companies, there is no problem with the politicians giving support to these important companies. But if it comes to high tech, that support doesn't seem to be forthcoming in the same extent. Let me just tell you then two specific cases of two companies that I've been involved in. In 1995, I was asked by the Financial Times to predict when Cambridge would have the first billion-dollar company by market cap, and I remember I crossed my fingers behind my back and predicted that in 10 years we might have one. Well, we actually have had 11 now. Only 5 had anything to do with me. But one, called ARM, has become our most successful company. It's not a very well-known company, but let me tell you that all of you actually wear our products right now, unless you don't have a mobile phone, because ARM has practically 100% market share. We say more than 95%, but actually it's probably more than 99% of the microprocessors in mobile phones. It's a company that's worth $25 billion. We have sold, we will sell over 10 billion ARM microprocessors this year. This is more processors than there are people on Earth. And the reason for that is that, say, the iPhone, if you pick a well-known phone, has 5 ARMs in them. So there's the iPad or the Samsung or the HTC or the Sony or Nokia. And the number is so high that in this 1 year we're selling more microprocessors than Intel has sold in its entire history as a company. So people say, but these are very cheap chips. Well, let me surprise you with another interesting statistic. Since 2010, the value of the ARM chips that are being sold worldwide by our licensees. ARM is a license company. We don't actually sell the processor itself. We sell licenses to companies that then sell the processors. So if you add up the value of all the ARM processors being sold worldwide by Qualcomm, Sony, Toshiba, Intel as well, interestingly, then the total dollar value of these ARM chips has also overtaken Intel sales. That's $40 billion a year. So it's a very little-known company because it only has 330 customers. And these are the 330 licensees, 330 semiconductor companies in the world that produce ARM chips. The second company I want to tell you about in a little more detail, because it is a good example of how European innovation has contributed to another breakthrough, and this time in gene sequencing. There are two professors of chemistry, Shankar Balasubramanian and David Klinneman, who invented sequencing by synthesis. And this completely revolutionized gene sequencing. It cost about $10 million to produce the human genome at that time on existing machines, which were ABI machines, the 3700. And we reduced the cost from $10 million to $1,000. $10 million to $1,000. So this is a factor of 10,000 in 5 years. I've lived off Moore's law all my life, which is a factor of 2 every 2 years, or you've got 5 doublings in a decade. It's a factor of 32 a decade, which was a factor of 10,000 in 5 years. And we haven't stopped here yet either. I think we will drive this down to below $100 in a few years' time, when I'm sure every newborn baby will be gene sequenced in the same way that we do blood groups of newborn babies, so we know if they need a transfusion, what blood transfusion we give to the baby. We will be able to do everybody's genome so that they know which drugs will be appropriate for them when they fall ill. So it's a very, very important development. But let me tell you the way we spun this thing out of Cambridge University. And it's a story of science, but it's also a story of management. We've always had the science in Europe. The thing that has changed over the last 20 years, and the reason why I think it makes a lot of sense to invest in European venture capital, is for 20 years we've worked very hard to improve our management capability. And if you look at Silicon Valley, during the first 20 years, American venture capital returns were not very good. And it must be said, European venture capital returns aren't very good. But after that 20-year period, when there was the knowledge, when there was the entrepreneurs, when there was the management that was educated during those 20 years, often through lots of failures. Now, we've had these 20 years, and my belief is that we'll create great companies over the next 10 years supported by venture capital. So this team, which we spun out from Cambridge University, produced a machine that increased the throughput by a factor of 100. And then, because of the venture capital companies that we had with our international networks, we went to the US and saw somebody called John West. John West was in charge of a $1 billion division of ABI, who at that time had an 80% market share of gene sequencing machines. And we said, we have bad news and we have good news. The bad news is that we have a machine that we've developed in Cambridge, which is 100 times better than the machine that you are selling at the moment, and we're going to blow you out of the water. The good news is we want you to do it. And he, being an MIT graduate, was willing to come to Cambridge, look at the technology, realized that it was a revolutionary technology that will change the way gene sequencing is being done, and he was willing to join us as a CEO. And that's quite a significant event. If you look at small European high technology companies, to attract international management talent, in this case from Silicon Valley, but from anywhere else in the world, and is a very important part of the puzzle. So he arrived in Cambridge, and those of you who know our scientists, and they're typical for European scientists, he arrived and he said, we will deliver a 1G machine in 12 months' time, 1G being a billion base pairs per experiment. And a number of people in the company left in disgust and said, this is a total idiot. There's absolutely no way we can deliver a 1G machine in 12 months' time. And some of them actually left the company because they thought this was such an idiotic idea. And the answer was they were both right. The company did deliver a 1G machine in 12 months' time, and it didn't work. So that's where the expertise of an outstanding CEO comes to bear. Because John West knew there was a market for machines that didn't work, because he'd been selling them for all. So why? Why was there a market for machines that didn't quite work? They did not work. They just didn't work as well as they should have. And the answer was that because of this revolution, that things got 100 times better. I mean, when have we last heard something getting 100 times better? All the big gene sequencing centers were in competition to do more genomes and do bigger patient cohorts on cancer and so on. So the advantage that they would get from this new machine was phenomenal. Now, he knew them all. He knew they were in a competition, and he went to them and said, there are 8 of you. I'm a little Cambridge company. I can only work with 3 of you. But the 3 of you who are willing to pay a full price for a machine that doesn't quite work yet, and if you are willing to work with me over the next year, we can make this machine really work, then you will be the first one to have this machine and can deploy it. They all 8 of them wanted to do that. Only 3 of them were chosen. And one of them was the Broad Institute had a particular condition. He said, I will not order 1 machine. I will order 15 machines from you under one condition. You don't tell anybody else that I did that. And indeed, they then became the main gene sequencing center in the world. These are 2 success stories in Europe based on university research. Maybe before I finish, I ought to just tell you the story about ARM, because when I started the ARM processor, I gave 2 advantages to that design team. One was I gave them no people, so it's the only microprocessor in the world that was produced by just 2 people. And the second advantage I gave them was no money. So they had to keep that processor really, really, really small and simple. And the side effect, which wasn't one of the original design aims, was that it consumed very little power. And because it consumed so little power, but had high performance, it was ideal for mobile phones. And Nokia came to see us and said, they wanted that processor, and said, what do you want, a PC processor and a mobile phone? It's a complete waste of time. So you wouldn't know what to do with that much. He said, yes, we do. We want all these new features on phones. And when Nokia adopted it, all the other companies then adopted it as well. So let me just conclude saying that innovation, in my opinion, is the single most important subject for support in Europe. And the only way to do this is do it very selectively, do it in areas where there is a cluster of expertise, where we're world-class, and where we can build world-class companies. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, Apple wasn't really competition in the UK because we had a 60% market share, and our computer was so much better than the Apple, of course. The problem was one of scale at the time. So arguably, I remember Bill Gates visiting me. We were the first company that grew from 0 to £100 million in revenue in just 5 years in Britain. It was a fantastic story of growth, but also a fantastic story, or a very sad story, of great difficulties after the 5 years. Akon then was a medium-sized company for another 10 years. And in fact, the BBC microarchitecture, together with the VAX 780, were the 2 longest-lived computer architectures ever in the world. And they educated British school kids on computing. But the difficulty was that the management expertise that I would argue we now have, we didn't have at the time. And I'm a physicist. I did my PhD in physics. I didn't know anything about stock control. We never had any stock. Anything that we bought shipped straight out. And when finally people didn't buy so many, we didn't have a warehouse. We got into serious financial difficulties. The other problem we had is we were very successful in the UK, but it was a global game. So we really had to be successful in the US and elsewhere, and that was something that we just didn't know how to do. Let me just put a slightly more positive spin on that, and that is contrasting where we are now to where we were 20 years ago. So the main changes that have happened, more so in ICT than in pharma, but it's happening in pharma as well, is that this really is becoming a global market. And the big advantage that American companies used to have, which they still do have in pharma, but no longer in ICT, was that being successful in America was good enough. Because everybody then said, well, they're so successful, we want to buy their stuff anyway. And it was almost a suck of the products out of America into the rest of the world. This is not the case anymore. These are global markets, and people often don't care where the product is coming from anymore. They care about the specification. So as long as we can produce a product that is suitable for the global market, they will buy it from us. They won't even know whether it was made in Germany, made in the UK, made in Portugal, or made in Estonia. If as Skype has. Skype is the worldwide success, and yet it was produced in Estonia. On the healthcare market in particular, we have a number of fantastic national assets, like the National Health Service in Britain, like many of the health services in Europe, where drug trials should be cheaper and it should be easier to do it. But partially because of regulatory issues, we do not provide the infrastructure that allows you to take advantage of the structure that the organizations that we have to do drug trials inexpensively. The great opportunity that I think that we have, especially with big data, is if we could get our regulatory scheme organized in such a way that we can get access at the health records for these trials, I think we could be a world-winning Europe.
Questions? Yes, back there. Please identify yourself.
My name is John Wild. First of all, thank you, Mr. Hauser, for an extraordinarily interesting talk. And I was particularly interested in your remarks about debt and how senseless it was for Europe to put more than 2 billion, or make more than 2 billion available, as it were, in debt. In my experience of European public spending, there is no precedent for investment in equity by the provision of equity. And my question is, which governments in Europe actually do that? In other words, which governments invest in high-tech startups?
Well, what we do have is we have the European Investment Fund. The slightly sad thing that has happened is...
Please turn off the microphone there.
The sad thing that has happened is they have become so dominant. There are now, I think, 60% of the money that goes into venture capital, that there is no diversity, there is no competition. So the ideal thing for this money that's set aside, the 2.7 million that's set aside, is that even if just a billion or even less than a billion was being put into the market of funder funds, not into venture capital, but funder funds that then select the venture capital companies, then there is a much more even playing field where you don't have a 60% gorilla making all the decisions on what European venture capital ought to do, but there is more market diversity, which I think would help fund these young venture capital teams as well. Well, what we do have is we have the European Investment Fund. The slightly sad thing that has happened is...
Please turn off the microphone there.
The sad thing that has happened is they have become so dominant. There are now, I think, 60% of the money that goes into venture capital, that there is no diversity, there is no competition. So the ideal thing for this money that's set aside, the 2.7 million that's set aside, is that even if just $1 billion or even less than $1 billion was being put into the market of funder funds, not into venture capital, but funder funds that then select the venture capital companies, then there is a much more even playing field where you don't have a 60% gorilla making all the decisions on what European venture capital ought to do, but there is more market diversity, which I think would help fund these young venture capital teams as well. Well, you touch a most important subject here, which is the cultural attitudes to innovation. When I first started doing high technology businesses at Cambridge University, and I suggested to some of our top professors to spin out companies, the reaction I got is, how dare you suggest that I dirty my pure academic hands and do this pact with mammon? I'm pleased to report that this has all but disappeared. So there has been, over the 20 years, 30 years now that I've been doing this, there's been this big cultural shift. But this cultural shift also needs a policy push. So there has been a lot of encouragement in Britain for universities to write impact reports, for example. So whenever they apply for any research grants, they have to write a paragraph on the impact that this research might have on industry. And this has changed people's attitude to the way they think about research. And I am just now delighted to see young people in Cambridge, researchers, talking about the companies that they might start and they are excited about. And, cultural changes take a long time.